So, yes, yeah, absolutely. So this is going to be lesson, and this is 4.1, right? We're in unit 4. Yeah, lesson 4.1, categorizing plants. Sorry? What? Okay. Glad we had this talk. All right. So as we talk about categorizing or classifying plants, you can tell me the first two categories because all plants belong to, what is the highest level of taxonomy we have? Very good. And what do we call that? They are indeed eukaryotes. Yeah, and is that their species, their domain, their what? It's above even kingdom. Domain. So they all belong to domain Eukarya. And when we say that they belong to domain Eukarya, that means that every plant is what? Has what? What is true about them if they belong to domain Eukarya? Sorry? Yeah, they have nuclei, they have other cellular organelles, they are complex cells. We are not talking about simple little cells. We are talking about more robust, more complicated cells. So they all belong to domain Eukarya, and then they belong to kingdom?
Plantae.
Very good. To kingdom Plantae, possibly Plantae. Should we ask Google to pronounce it?
Yeah. I'm content with Plantae.
I always just enjoy listening to Google pronounce things, so I'm going to do it. Oh. Is it not like this scientific word? Is it just like not feeling it? Well.
Plant.
Okay, there we go. That's okay. Doesn't like kingdom Plantae. Okay, so all plants belong to domain Eukarya, kingdom Plantae. And then that means exactly what we just said. All plants are multicellular complex eukaryotes. There are no single-celled plants. And we said that means that they have nuclei and organelles. What else do you know about plants? What else could you say all plants blank? Yeah. Sorry? Did you say feed or need or what? Interestingly, yes, but what else? Preston said at the back. What about CO2? I mean, they use both, but what do they use CO2 for? What do plants do that humans, for example, do not? Very good. All plants photosynthesize. Oh, less common spelling of photosynthesize without a Z. There we go. And who can tell me what the chemical equation of photosynthesis is? That's one of the products. What's the reaction? It is. To balance this, how many of these would I need? I do, yeah, you're right. I'm just sliding it over. Yeah, 6 CO2s. Yeah, and that's going to leave us with all of these oxygens left over. So 6 of these. Really good. And you're right. To make that happen, we need sunlight. If you're not in chemistry, ignore what I'm about to say. Delta H, positive or negative? Very good. Very good, because energy is going in, right? So we put energy in. And the energy is stored in those sugars. And plants are very clever because they store the energy in a molecule, sugar, that isn't just useful for energy storage, though it is, it's also a great building block. It's actually very interesting. You can think of it, ironically, a lot like wood, right? We don't really think of it this way, but imagine if you were a pioneer, if you were a First Nations individual or whatever, if you lived in this country before the advent of industrial technology, wood was both your building material and your energy supply, right? If you think about it, you had to build your structures out of wood, but also you would have a wood pile. I mean, I still have a wood pile in my backyard because we light fires. And I actually don't have a wood-burning stove in my house anymore. We have a gas fireplace, but my parents have a furnace they almost never turn on. They heat their house entirely with wood fires. In fact, my dad has a hot water heater that can be gas-powered but can also be wood-fired. And he keeps his water hot with the same fire that they warm the house with in the winter. Pretty cool, right? So if you think about it, it is a building block and energy storage. And sugar occupies the same thing. Starches are just big chains of sugar. And that's what holds like a potato and things like that together. Rice, grains. Cellulose is just a different way of making a chain out of sugar. And that is what makes like the woody part of wood, but it's also what makes like the stem of a plant, the rigid material, celery, all that stuff, everything that we can't digest. All of that is just sugar building blocks. So photosynthesis is this genius process where they capture energy, they store it in a molecule that can be used as an energy trap, can be used as a place where you can hold energy till you burn it, but also as a building block. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you know when we took the mobile lab?
Oh shoot, Winger. But you know what?
I lost something on it, so that I just.
Yeah, Winger's got.
Okay, thank you.
Now, how do plants do this? Do they just like see that sunlight coming in and they go, "Hey, sunlight, turn this stuff into sugar"?
Yeah.
And the sunlight's like, "Yeah, okay, you asked me and you're a plant. That's cool." But then if animal cells ask, the sun's like, "No, not doing it." What do plants have? Come on, grade 10 science. Yeah, you do this in grade 10. Chloroplasts? Ring a bell? Not so much? That's okay, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it because plants have an organelle called a chloroplast. Containing probably. There's exceptions to everything. if you take grade 12 biology, which I highly recommend you do because it's a wonderful course, we will learn the very complex mechanisms and steps. This reaction, which we show as one step, doesn't happen as one step at all. In fact, it is a very complicated series and system of reactions that happen inside a plant. It really is a big factory operation. So we write the summary reaction here, which is fine, that's accurate, but it does not tell the whole story. I like this. This is good. Yeah, so I encourage you, if you take that, to learn how. What else do we know about plant cells? They photosynthesize. They have a compound. They have a chloroplast, which contains chlorophyll. Do you remember anything else from grade 10 biology? You should have learned the difference between plant cells and animal cells. Good. Which one does? Yeah, plant cells have rigid cell walls. This is why you need a skeleton, and without a skeleton, you would just kind of be smushy because your cells are not themselves rigid. Plant cells are rigid. They have this rigid cell wall that surrounds them, which means that a plant made of cells put together will be rigid. And obviously, are some cell types more rigid than others? Yes. Though you know what, like the trick in trees is, you let some of those cells just die and ossify and get hard. Does that make sense? You think of like the woody portion of a tree, and that is often like dead cells that are just meant there to be especially rigid. But they don't do what we do, which is have to make this rigid skeleton made of something else. Their cells alone have a rigidity to it. Does that make sense? If you picture, picture like a dandelion stalk, it's that thing where it is both flexible and rigid at the same time. Can you kind of picture that? Where it can be bent, it can move, it can sway, but it's strong, and it's not perfectly strong because not only can you bend it, but you can snap it, right? You can break it, and you can only break something that has some rigidity to it, right? Does that make sense? Cool. All plants grow. Can move in one spot, but are not mobile. A plant can absolutely move. If you have ever moved a plant from one place to another in a room, it will move itself ever so slightly so that its leaves will all face the sunlight. You can try this at home. Go, if your mom or your dad or your aunt or your uncle or your grandma or your grandpa has a plant facing a window, turn it around and watch. Come back a few hours later. The leaves will have all shifted so that they're getting sunlight again. Yeah, exactly. And you can do that intentionally to get the plant to grow the way you want to grow. If you grow tomatoes in your backyard, if you give it a trellis, it will grow the way you want it to. I have grapes in my backyard. And, we give them... My wife grew up on a fruit farm, and about 10 years ago, her dad sold the family farm. They'd owned it for like 400 years. It was semi-traumatic. So, yeah, literally. She grew up on a street like called Culp Road, and she was a culp. Like, her family's been here since like the 1600s. So, yeah. Well, long story short, like nobody's a farmer, and it was a big, fully operational farm. And my father-in-law was a full-time GM employee, a full-time farmer, was on town council, and he just had a heart attack. And at some point you go, maybe you need to downsize. So they sold it. But yeah, so my wife's way of emotionally coping with this was turning my house into a farm. And every week she threatens me that she's going to get chickens. And every week I say, like, I don't want to be that neighbor, Brett. I don't want to have chickens. And every week she's like, I might get chickens. And I'm like, well, we'll talk. I might get a Tesla. Anyway, it's become a bit of an arms race. But yeah, I really like it. I really like plants. Like I said, I'm not very good with them, but I really enjoy it. I find it incredibly soothing to have nice gardens and trees.
If you ever somehow kill one of your wife's plants,
Oh, let me tell you.
you can be like, it absorbed a curse. Because I heard that if a plant dies, then it absorbs a curse.
Man, let me tell you something. I have taken many curses out of the world. 1 year, my wife had to, when she was in midwifery school, she had to spend an entire 4 months out of, like, way far away on a placement. And I managed to kill all of her, like not some of them, like all of them. Wow. Yeah, it was bad. It was not. And I was trying. I really was trying. I'm not good with plants, but I love them. Yes. Yeah, and that comes back to that rigidity. Now, they can take many different shapes. You're going to see that as we go. There's still a great variety there. We tend to draw them in that specific boxy shape, but they can take many different shapes. But they have that characteristic cell wall, which makes them more rigid. Did that answer your question? Cool. All right, so how do we classify plants? Today is going to be just like the quickest rundown of the way that we classify plants. And you've got to start putting things into categories, all right? And the quickest category we can put them into is vascular versus non-vascular. This is going to be our first big category. What does vascular mean? We talked about your cardiovascular system. That was your heart and all of your... Have you already expunged this from your memory, crew? Your blood vessels, right? Remember that? Veins, arteries, capillaries. Vascular refers to vessels that carry fluid. 2 S's in vessels. Can someone Google that for me? There are 2 S's? Good. I will rewrite that neatly. Thank you. See, I should have trusted my cheat sheet, but Ryan, thank you for your correction. I appreciate it. Most plants are vascular. Not what you thought I was going to say, was it? What is the easiest way to see that a plant is vascular if you think about going out to a tree in your backyard? If you have a nice tree in their backyard.
Shine a light on it, see if it's
Sure. Well, what part of the plant is easy to see its veins? Yeah, if you look at the leaves of a plant, it's usually quite easy to see the veins in it, right? But where else does your tree have vascular tissue? Well, if you think about it, it has roots, right? And vessels that move that water and nutrients through the plant. Okay, ready for some amazing art? This lesson of all of them in this entire course might feature the most art I'm going to have to do. Is that enough? By the way, if you don't feel like drawing any of my drawings, I have printed out a page that has most of the major drawings attached. But I'm going to draw them so we can talk about them. But if you want to skip the drawing stage, I always find it's helpful to draw, even if you do a crappy job like I do. It just kind of helps you think about it. And then you can get the nice drawing later. I used to just give the handouts right away, but I've found that it really is helpful to have people kind of make an effort to make diagrams themselves. All right, so a good example of this is the veins in a leaf. But of course, if the veins in a leaf are vascular tissue, that is obviously coming through here, which, by the way, if you look at, I mean, what a diagram, right? You have a tube here, and it branches off, and it supplies fluids and nutrients all throughout the leaf. But how did the water get up to here? Well, I guess I should draw myself a little plant. Maybe I'll go green, and we'll, here we go. Here we go, and then I'm going to draw some roots. Look at all those roots. Oh, Joe, you're such a great artist. And of course, they are often quite fibrous. So there's little fibers coming off the roots. I meant to take a picture the other day. We had a windstorm take a neighbor's tree down, and the roots on that thing were just astounding. It was such a sight to behold. It was really cool, and I was very thankful it didn't land on my house.
A big tree falls down in the windstorm, and it's just, the first thing is like, oh wow, look at those roots. It's so cool.
Yeah. I think it's good to be curious in life. And you know what? Let's make this guy a flower. Just because I can. Try and stop me. Oh, there he is. Isn't he a happy... Well, I changed my mind. He's a happy-looking flower now. Isn't that better? Isn't it nice to have a little flower there? Yeah, he makes me happy. Okay. So you can see that we also must have vascular tissue in the stem and in roots. So a plant, just like you have a circulatory system running through you, a plant has a vascular system that runs through the entire plant as well, right? From the tip of the roots all the way up to the last leaf and the last stem. What is a non-vascular plant then? Okay. Could that plant be tall? When you think of plants, you think of something that grows up, right? You think of something that grows up and has branches maybe, or at least leaves or stems or something. And even a grass, if you look at a blade of grass, it grows up, right? It's not very tall, but does water have to get to the top of that grass? Yeah, grass is vascular. So what would a plant have to be like to not be vascular? There's not many of them. Most plants are vascular. Mosses, good.
Well, doesn't it have
There aren't many, but mosses are an example. Mosses are plants. Lichens, by the way, look similar to mosses, but they are fungi. But mosses, liverworts, which is the grossest sounding plant I can imagine. But these guys are all non-vascular plants. And if they do have roots, they're just structural to hold them in place. And, I mean, think about a moss. Does it have, like, root-like structures? Yeah, but where are they running into? Into nice soil full of water? No, all over a rock. Are they sucking a lot of water out of that rock? No, right? So if they do have roots, they are structural. And they have to absorb water directly where photosynthesis happens. There's no transport system. In a tree, where does the photosynthesis happen? Where? In a tree, where does photosynthesis happen? What part of the tree collects the light?
Leaves.
The leaves. But where do you water a tree? All over the leaves? No, you water the soil, you water the roots. Because a tree is designed to collect water in the roots and move it up to the leaves. But in a non-vascular plant, like a moss, like a liverwort, they have to absorb water directly where the photosynthesis happens. They don't have a transport system. So this, then, is our structure so far. We're going to make a diagram of like a family tree, kind of. We're going to say, if our main category is plants, what is our first delineation between plant types? Vascular and... Go faster. Man, I got a bad foot and I'm keeping up. Doesn't even make sense. Doesn't even make sense. Here, I'll walk there and back to give you time. Yeah. Oh, for God's sakes. I gotta walk twice. There you go. Okay, so our first delineation is between vascular and non-vascular.
I'm that far back.
Oh, well, there'll be lots of, it's online. Just leave a little space and keep up from here.
Online.
So, vascular and non-vascular plants. And then, once we go from there, we said that most plants are vascular. So that's where we're going to focus. We're not going to look at any more classifications within non-vascular. Does that mean there aren't any? Well, there's lots. Right? There's still lots of species there, lots of things. But our next major category is going to be that we're going to divide up the vascular plants into different categories. And listen, when we divide things, we just look for convenient traits. So the next thing we look for is we say, okay, we're going to classify based on, first we looked at, do they have vascularization or not? Do they have a system for moving transport? The next thing we're going to look at is what type of seeds they produce. Does that make sense? What kind of seeds they produce. And from there, we are going to look at vascular plants, and we are going to cut them into two categories as well. And the two categories are going to be called gymnosperms and angiosperms. And aside from chuckling at it, the word you will notice in these two terms, of course, is sperm, which makes sense because we are talking about seeds, right? And just as sperm are the male sex cells in animals, all animals? Mammals, certainly. Not fair to say all animals. But just like sperm are male sex cells, seeds are the male sex cells of a plant. By the way, just like animals, plants have male sex cells and female sex cells. One is on the plant that needs to be fertilized, and the other is the one that gets sent off, and that is the seed, right? So anyway, as it happens with plants, first they are fertilized, then they are distributed. Different process, but same basic idea. So we classify based on seeds. So that's going to be our second major level of classification. Gymnosperms versus angiosperms. And this is classifying based on seeds. And we'll write that in a moment. And what did we say? Well, we said seeds are sex cells, so let's write that. If seeds are sex cells, are they haploid or diploid? Which one is it? We have disagreement. You know how I settle disagreement? I'm going to drop the cane in the middle and one of you is going to walk out. That's who's right. That's not an appropriate joke. I'm glad I recorded that. Well, remember, in all of our normal cells, how many copies of each chromosome do we have? 2. But in our sex cells, we have 1. So diploid means 2 copies. So diploid would be a normal plant cell. Haploid are sex cells. Haploids have half as much as that. Really, they should be called like singloid or something, but they're not. So there you go. So what's in a seed? Well, actually, once fertilized, a seed will actually be diploid because it will actually be a fertilized cell. And eventually, by the time a plant releases a fertilized seed, it contains the embryo of a new plant and a food source. And this is why, by the way, we like to eat the seeds of plants because they have food sources, right? So we're like, oh, hey, wheat plant, you like to make wheat? Yeah, we're going to grind that up and make bread out of it. Ha, joke's on you. We ate the embryo of your young plants. And we do this to chickens too, right? We're like, oh, what's that? You want to reproduce and make no more chickens? Too bad. I want to make an omelet. Right? We're just like, no, that's my egg now, bird that had to grow a large calcium sphere inside its own body and then pump it out. No, making eggs, right? But plants are clever because you know what plants have learned to do? Plants have evolved so that realizing that animals were going to come eat their seeds, they designed their seeds to, No, to take advantage of this. Because if you think about it, if you're a strawberry and you just make seeds and they fall down, where can your new strawberry plants grow? Well, just where you were, right? But what if you designed a seed that had a food source around it that was delicious, and a bear comes along and eats you, and then, what do bears do in the woods? Right, as one does. Now your seed has been moved to a different place, and it's sitting in a nice pile of fertilizer. Seriously, think about it. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. So plant seeds have been designed where, at least initially, the evolution shows that that food source serves as a food source for the embryo. But over time, that evolution has happened that food source serves as a food source for some animal that then is going to take your seeds and spread them for you and fertilize them for you. Pretty clever. Humans are like, no, joke's on you, we have indoor plumbing. You're just going to go get sent through a water reclamation site and we'll like blast you with UV radiation. Humans really do like to mess things up, don't we? But when other animals eat plant cells or plant seeds, they tend to spread them for them. And there's tough material that protects the embryo. Even from your digestive tract. No, I mean, again, I'll tell you, those peach trees have sure domesticated my wife. Like, she'll go out there. I have seen her, because she wants to do this organically. I have seen her with a magnifying glass and tweezers pulling aphids off a tree one at a time. And then, like, spraying with, like, teas and things like that to keep them off. It's like, this is an insane amount of work. But she finds it soothing. Okay, so what's the difference then if we have two types, angiosperms and gymnosperms? Well, let's make a chart. And there's nothing magical about this. Again, it's just helpful when dividing things into categories to find big groups of species that have similar traits. So that's all this is. These are just big groups of species that have similar traits. So angiosperms are those plants that have enclosed seeds. They're more common. And gymnosperms, if angiosperms have enclosed seeds, then gymnosperms must not. So they have non-enclosed seeds. We'll talk about what that looks like. Don't worry. If you're like, what the hell does that mean? Don't worry. We'll talk about it. These are less common. But if you think about like a pea, the seed is inside of the pea, right? That's an enclosed seed. If you think about nuts or things like that, those are all seeds that are inside of something, right? Angiosperms are flowering plants. Anything that flowers is an angiosperm, and it has enclosed seeds of one sort or another. And that includes some trees. Do all trees flower? First of all, when it's a tree and it makes flowers, we call them B word. Sometimes, more commonly, blossoms, right? Apple blossoms, cherry blossoms. But keep in mind, they can be quite fine, right? Like an oak tree produces blossoms, but they're just very, very small and kind of dense. And then they fall all over your yard and they like litter the place. Same with maple. But the maple trees absolutely blossom, but they're just incredibly fine. Does anyone have a maple tree in their backyard? And then there's that month in the spring where you go back there and you're like, oh man, my yard is a disastrous mess right now. So in trees, these have blossoms, and they make fruit, which includes nuts, right? Nuts are a fruit. If angiosperms are flowering, gymnosperms are non-flowering. And are some trees non-flowering? What trees do not produce fruit? And what do they produce instead? If a tree doesn't produce fruit or nuts, how does it spread? Yeah, but what kind of seeds? If they're not held in fruit, cones, conifers, your coniferous trees. So your coniferous trees are gymnosperms, whereas all of your blossoming fruit, let's try that again, blossoming fruit-bearing trees are angiosperms. And from here, we're going to have one last division we're going to learn about today. And you're going to see some real good Orlando art. You ready? Oh, you're ready. All right. Which of these did we say is more common? More plants are angiosperms, so we're going to divide them further. You don't need to draw this again if you don't want, but I'm going to draw it again just so we can kind of see. We have plants. From plants, what first major categories did we break into? Vascular and non-vascular. And then from vascular, what arrangement did we make next? Just did it. Very good. Gymnosperms. Angiosperms. And then we said within that, which is the more common of these two? These are your flowering and your non-flowering plants, and more plants are flowering plants, angiosperms. And so there, we cut them into two categories again, and this is the last category we're going to learn about here, but we call them monocots and dicots. And we'll talk about what that means in about 2 seconds. I don't want you to think, by the way, that this covers all the classification of plants or anything. This is just a very simple organizational tree. If you were a botanist, you would have a much more complex system of classifying plants. Does that make sense? A full taxonomy. So I'm just giving you a little taste of what that might look like. I'm wondering if I did the thing. Oh, see, I did the thing. See how it just gets progressively wider as I go? I just can't stop myself from doing that when I take a note, and I don't know why. Actually, I do know why. It's because people say, hey, can you back up? And so I zoom out so we can see more. And then when I zoom out so we can see more, I have more width to work with. And even though I tell myself don't use it, slowly but surely I use it. Anyway, enough about me. Let's get to it. So this is our last categorization that we're going to look at. Monocots versus dicots. Now, let me ask you this. You should be able to interpret at least half of what each of these words means. Mono and di mean what? One. Two. Okay, so one cot and two cots, these are the kinds of plants. Well, this is classifying plants based on their classifying angiosperms specifically. And remind me again, when we talked about angiosperms and gymnosperms, that was classifying based on the sperm gives us the hint. That's classifying based on the types of seeds. Well, now, specifically, we're classifying angiosperms based on a specific part of their seed called the cotyledon. And don't worry, we will define that. And I'm even going to spell it. Oh, I'm even going to spell it right. What in the heck is a cotyledon? Well, it is the first leaf or leaves, because of course, looking at this, how many might you have? One or two. Of an embryonic plant. Tomorrow, we're going to actually open up some seeds, take a look at them under the scope, and one of the things you're going to see is that when you open up a seed, you can see a little leaf. It's in there. Because when the plant starts to grow, it's going to, to begin with, it gets its energy supply from the seed. Remember we said there's a food source in there? But that is obviously not going to last forever. So what does it need to be able to do? Photosynthesize. And if it's going to photosynthesize, what does it need? Needs a leaf, right? That's how you photosynthesize. And so as a seed, as an embryo, and of course, since we're talking about angiosperms, we are talking about enclosed seeds. Inside of that enclosed seed is an embryo, is a small embryonic plant, a small developing plant. And that already has embryonic roots, and it already has an embryonic leaf. And it just so happens that when you open up that seed and look, whether it has one embryonic leaf or two embryonic leaves is a good predictor of a lot of what the traits of that adult plant will be. Does that make sense? This happens because of evolutionary processes that, for the most part, monocots and dicots have evolved along different lines and they have different traits. So let's talk about monocots and dicots, which means we're going to make another table. This whole unit won't be this dry, by the way, I promise. If this is like torture for you. I always really enjoyed plant class, but I understand it's not everyone's cup of tea. When I was in university, our plant professor was this guy named Doug Bruce, and he was the most entertaining professor in the world. He was really, really funny, really, really nice guy. Funny you should mention that because he was Scottish. And he used to, from time to time, come in like full Scottish regalia, like kilt and the sash and like the whole thing, yeah. And on Robbie Burns Day every year, he would read a Robbie Burns poem in like the proper like Scottish. He was a great guy, very, very good professor. I wish I could be half as interesting as he, but I'm not. Anyway, monocots, as the name suggests, have a single embryonic leaf when you open up the seed, and you can see that. Some seeds make it easier to see, some make it harder to see, but a monocot has one cotyledon, a dicot has two cotyledons. And then it just so happens that, and there are exceptions to everything, but the overwhelming majority of monocots, when they evolve sorry? And it is correct with the Y first. You know what I always say? Y before E. That's it. No. Okay. Monocots, when they develop into full plants, will have parallel veins. And that may sound confusing, but when I draw it in all of my drawing glory, you're going to be like, oh, I've seen plants like that. Picture like, and this is often like house plants, where when you get the leaf, here's the leaf, and the veins of the leaf don't run like this. Can you picture that? Grass is like that. You ever split grass up? You ever do that? You can whistle through it. Is that the worst looking leaf anyone has ever drawn? Maybe. That might be it. That might be the one. Maybe on the great day of judgment, they will say, on May 11th, 2022, the worst leaf ever drawn was drawn. And it was this guy. Whereas dicots tend to grow into the more common when we think of the veins in a leaf. That kind of net-like veins. And this would be, if you picture an oak leaf, or a maple leaf. I'm going to draw a maple leaf. Ready? It's going to be great because I'm a great artist. Oh, man. There we go. Oh, Canada. Our home and native land. Right? But we imagine these leaves and they have this very net-like structure of veins going through them. That is almost certainly a dicot plant. Remember when I said this was the worst leaf ever? And it was for a while. For a while it was, and then it wasn't. It's an irony, isn't it? I feel ashamed. Now, that tells us what the vascularization is like in the leaves, but that's not the only place the vascularization is different. To get to the leaves, where do there also have to be veins in a plant? In the stems. So let's talk about the stems. The stems, fun fact about stem, it starts with an S, not a T. Stems have vascular bundles, which are just bundles of veins, randomly arranged. So if you look at the vein or the stem of a monocot, you will see that there are just kind of randomly throughout these veins that go down like that. Maybe I'll just draw them. That's going to go better than if I try to dot them. But see, they're just randomly arranged. They could be anywhere in the stem. Does that kind of make sense? On the other hand, dicots do not have, their stems have neat rings of vascular cells. Again, we're talking about the stems here. So if you look at the stem of any dicot, and it will typically have there's the stem, and it will typically have a nice, neat ring of vascular tissue that goes around it just like that. Very neatly organized. And these, of course, go down into the plant. Come saw.
Which one would celery be? The monocot or the dicot?
I don't know off the top of my head. I tend to think of those being neatly arranged.
Yes.
So I guess I would tend to think dicot, but I'm not entirely sure.
That would be good for representation.
Yeah, and actually tomorrow you're going to be picking a plant, so you could pick celery. Now, we've talked about what the veins are like in the leaves. We've talked about what the veins are like in the stems. Where else do we find veins? The leaves, the stems, and, oh, you're good, the roots. And lo and behold, there is a difference in the roots of monocots and dicots too. And this is a neat thing. This is true in animal studies too. We call this embryology. We're studying the embryo. Embryos that have certain characteristics will lead to adult animals that have characteristics. And in plants, embryos that are similar, one leaf versus two leaf, which seems like a random little difference, but they tend to categorize into categories of plants that are very similar. Now, are there exceptions? It's exceptions to everything. But these are the kind of general rule. So, we've talked about stems, we've talked about leaves, now we'll talk about roots. And monocots tend to have fibrous, or if you're a monster, fibrous root systems. All right, so if you imagine, here's our ground. Where's a ground color? There's a nice, that's pretty dirt colored. Okay, so there's my brown and orange are the same color. You've never seen orange colored soil before? So there we go. We've got our soil. Oh, it looks so nice. What nice soil. I want to plant a plant there. And we plant a little plant. Maybe this happy little guy. and he's got roots, and his roots tend to just be this mass of fibers. You ever seen a plant like that? You pull the roots out and it just looks like a big mess of individual fibers. Yeah, absolutely. On the other hand, dicots tend to have a taproot system. And this is where we've got our ground. You can see I was always very good at coloring. There's our ground. And we've got our plant. Here's our plant. But a taproot tends to have a large major root that goes down like this, and then it will have offshoots of it. And obviously, when you think about like most trees' roots, you're picturing something like this, right? Like big individual root vessels that run off like that. And they may still have fibers coming off of them, but there are large structures there that we call taproots. And that can be very simple as well. Picture a carrot. Of course, a carrot is the root, right? And the plant grows up above. That is just one single taproot going down, but they can also have branches like this. And then this one I find so funny, or just so random, but we've talked about leaves, we've talked about stems, we've talked about roots, but of course, if we're talking about dicots, if we're talking about angiosperms, what else do angiosperms have? Oh, that's right. Yeah, they have flowers. Good. Angiosperms have flowers. And I just think this is so crazy, but it tends to be that if something is a monocot, if something only has one cotyledon, one embryonic leaf in its cell, then they tend to have petals in multiples of 3. And now I have to draw something that has a petal in a multiple of 3. So let's do that. And when I draw the roots of this, what should I draw? Yeah, I should draw a nice fibrous root system. So there's my fibrous root system. Oh, look how fibrous we are. Look at all those fibers. And I'm going to draw a couple of leaves. Hey, when I draw these leaves, how should I draw the veins in the leaves? Straight like that? No, not like that. That was silly. We call them parallel leaf systems. So they're the parallel veins of my leaves. And when I go to draw flowers of this, multiples of 3. So I'm going to draw 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There is my beautiful flower. Isn't she pretty? I will name her Brunhilde. Sorry? They all have both, right? Every plant has male parts and female parts. So do they have genders? No. But do they have sexes? Well, yes and no, because they both have both, right? All right, so there we are. There is my monocot. Now, on the other hand, these tend to have petals in multiples of 4 or 5. So when I draw this fine fella, there we are. There's my stem. When I draw the roots, what should I draw? Yeah, taproot. So there's my taproot, and maybe there's, there we are, and then, there's fibers coming off that throughout. And when I go to draw the leaves, what should they look like? Should I draw them like that? No, because that would be typical of monocots, but this is a dicot. So what do their leaves typically look like? Yeah, they have branches, right? They are like that. I saw yesterday that Andy Warhol's painting of Marilyn Monroe went for like a record, what was it, like $145 million or something? One day, you can turn this into an NFT and sell it, I'm sure, for just $148 million. People will be like, what an amazing set of leaves and taproots. He was such a visionary artist. And this guy, I'm going to give just 4 petals. Like what's a flower that has 4 petals? Like a poppy. There you go. I like that. So there he is. And there we go. Probably should have drawn that green in the middle, but that's okay. No idea. Because when you think of a clover, you're thinking of the leaves, right? So I don't even know what the bloom of a clover looks like. I have no idea. All right, so that is our basic rundown today. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not really doing this because it matters in your life if you know the difference between a monocot or a dicot. And I always like to clarify why we learn something. So why learn this? Is it just to kill a day? Is it to give me a chance to show off my amazing art?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I hope not, because if so, I feel like that was wasted effort. But rather, what I want to get across is this. An important thing for scientists always is to deal with the massive volume of information out there. There's not 10 plants in the world, or 100 plants in the world, or 1,000 plants in the world. We're talking about millions of different species that are all different, that all have their own life cycle, that all have their own properties, that all have their own tendencies. And to make that even remotely manageable, scientists have to categorize. This is one set of categorizations, and the first thing I'll say is, not every plant that you can think of is going to fit into this categorization, because this is just the lightest little scraping of the surface, just the tip of an enormous iceberg, as they say. So I don't want you to think that, like, I now know plant classification. Far from it, I just always want to give you a taste of how complicated these classification systems are, because you have to understand that science deals with a massive, 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 ever-changing volume of information. And organizing that information is paramount if you're going to do anything with it. Does that make sense? If you imagine, if all the information that were written about plants were in your Google Docs, you might want to have some folders in that thing. Another thing we could talk about. You guys don't love your folders. Oh man, have I noticed that. Anyway. So that's simple. No homework today, no assignments and things like that. What could you be working on? I started marking your dissection reports yesterday. Man, I only got through 2 of them because I was in a meeting and I was supposed to be looking like I was paying attention. Can you imagine? I went to this meeting yesterday. I just want you to picture this. No, I do. I want you to picture this. You're like at a desk, and there's like someone up front talking for like 75 minutes. You just sit there, and like we had notes, and we were kind of like filling them in. We were like, 75 minutes! Can you imagine? I can't imagine. Anyway, thank God nobody has to do that every day.